Hello, I'm Dave Apsley, your host for Tree Talk, and I'm here to introduce you to our guest today. It's a district biologist with the National Wild Turkey Federation, Lee Crocker. Welcome, Lee.
It's great to be here, Dave. Excited.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about private lands management. We call them family forest owners, and we're going to talk a little bit about what they can do to manage their woodlands. So to give some folks a little background, I'd like to start off with a slide showing a little bit of history of what's happened to our forest land in Ohio. Kind of gives a little backdrop and gives you an idea what's happened in the past. So this slide is actually from Division of Forestry's webpage, and it shows how we went from a low in Ohio of about 10% forest, and you can see over time from the 1940s up through the 90s how the land has changed from open ground to forest ground. We've actually gone from, like I said, a low of about 10% forest to now we're at about 30% forest, and we've kind of leveled off. So I'm kind of curious, Lee, what your thoughts are on how that's affected some of our wildlife populations.
Well, Dave, it's had a dramatic effect on wildlife. You think back in the 40s, there was no wild turkey in Ohio. They'd been extirpated out of the state and removed, and that a lot of that's because there was no or very little forest land left with the 10% there. So, but there's other species. There's always a positive and a negative effect when you're talking with what you do on your forest or on your land as far as wildlife. So there were certain species like bobwhite quail that when you opened that up and you had weedy areas and grassy areas and more open land and brush, that the bobwhite quail benefited from that. The wild turkey, though, was it hurt the wild turkey with less forest land. It was good for other species. You think of ruffed grouse, who needs kind of a young forest, a woody forest, young woody forest to survive. It was great for them. For something like a deer, they're a generalist, so a generalist can survive in a lot of different habitats. So it can survive in cropland, forest land, brushy areas, all different kinds of areas the deer can utilize. So their population, once they began to come back into the state, has really boomed. And even if we lost more woodland, we'd still have a large population of deer.
It is really hard to believe that around the turn of the previous century, we had no deer in Ohio, and we've recovered back to the point now where we've got quite a few. Back to the grouse story a little bit. Grouse populations were at these all-time highs, probably what, in the 80s, 70s?
70s and 80s,
so.
Yes.
And as our forest has aged, if you notice that a lot of that forest that we have in Ohio, 2/3 of it was not forest land in, say, the 30s and 40s. So as it aged, it was perfect habitat for a while. And now what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. It was great habitat, and some of that was old farmland, so it took it longer to recover. But now that forest is getting older. If you look at the data in Ohio, all of our forests are getting older, and they're turning into saw timber size stands and large pole size stands. And so a grouse, after that woods gets to be about 15 years old, he's looking for another place to live. It just isn't suitable for them to go through their life cycle with older forests. So it's a dramatic effect on them, and we've seen a serious decline of grouse in Ohio, as in other states. Indiana actually just recently listed their grouse as a threatened species.
So it comes down to more habitat. A lot of times people want to explain, our grouse populations or our quail populations are down because of coyotes and all this. But if you've got the right habitat, that's a big key piece of it. Let's get the next slide up about ownership of our lands in Ohio, if you guys don't mind. That's an older shot of what Ohio used to look like and some of the severe erosion that took place. A lot of our state forest land before the state acquired it looked like that.
And that also shows you that picture talking about how beat up the land was and how long it took some of that to recover. But it was perfect habitat for quail, and it's got a little older, perfect habitat for ruffed grouse, but not very good habitat for something like wild turkey or for some of our forest songbirds.
So, and if you go think about that picture a little bit, the topsoil was gone, so that's why it took so long to recover. This slide's just to give you an idea of the ownership patterns in Ohio. Most people don't realize it, but a big portion, about 72% of our woodlands in Ohio, are owned by private woodland owners. So That's why it's important to have district biologists and biologists with the Division of Wildlife as well to help family forest or individuals to manage those woodlands.
The other thing you see on that is 70, 1 or 2% is family forest, but also another 15% is in private forest. So really the public owns very little land in Ohio, and so that's a very big change from what occurs out west and some of our northern states.
And this one I think is very interesting. When I went to school, and we have to bring up Purdue a little bit while we're on, because Lee and I are both Purdue grads.
That's right, boiler up.
So we always talked about managing private woodlands for timber, but when you look at why people in Ohio own woodlands, it's not timber, it's wildlife and beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk to people, very few people that I've dealt with over my 39 years of working in this field have said, I want to manage for timber only. There's all kind of other uses. Just the value that they got, the sentimental value. Maybe it came from the family, or just a place to relax on the weekends, place to hunt, a place to just go out and enjoy nature. Most people are using it for a lot of other reasons.
And the interesting thing, and I think what a lot of people don't realize, is that managing it for timber or for wood products and income can match up with wildlife management as well. So you can actually have your cake and eat it too a little bit if you're really planning and working with it. So this is another slide that kind of goes back to the earlier part of the discussion on how forests change over time. And if land's abandoned from agriculture, it takes a while to go through this process from open ground to mature forest. But if we do a timber harvest, we can march through this process that we call succession relatively quickly. And this was an older graphic, but it really illustrates, I think, the importance of the habitat, and that certain species really require different habitat elements.
Yeah, there's a lot of species going to use each one of these habitats, and with a good forest, healthy forest soils and good growing conditions, you harvest an area, it's changing from what's using that forest within a first 5 to 10 years. Species begin to change. We also have found some really interesting information in the last few years at the Vent and Furnace, where forest songbirds that typically in the past were thought to use older forests were utilizing these cutover areas for food right after they've the nest, right after the hatching, and so the young were coming in there and getting food from from those areas. So it's pretty neat how they use all these different areas, some of these species that we once thought were pretty much dominant old forest species.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and as a private woodland owner, I own 30 acres in Jackson County, and you think, well, how can I have an impact on deer or turkey or whatever? So are there some things you can recommend for me on a piece of property, or how would you go about advising me to manage that property for wildlife?
When we're thinking about turkey, one of the kind of the limiting factors that we see in Ohio is what we call nesting habitat and brood habitat. And nesting habitat's just what it says. It's the places for the hens to go and to nest, that provides some security, that gives them a chance to overcome predators, to avoid predators, and not to have the nest destroyed, those types of things. And then brood habitat is a place when those young poults hatch out, a place where the hen can take them and they can feed. And those first 4 weeks are so critical with a turkey brood, because they need almost 100% protein. So they're eating insects. They need kind of open areas, weedy areas with a lot of herbaceous vegetation to give them a variety of insects, so they can go in there and feed on those. So if you can create some of that critical habitat, the nesting habitat, that brood habitat, it's going to be great for turkey. For deer, if it's an old forest, deer need some browse, woody plants, things that they can eat and feed on. And so doing some harvesting, doing some timber stand improvement, removing invasives, all these things will help increase that browse, which will increase food for your deer, but also will increase the security cover for those deer after you've had a harvest.
Okay, just curious, you mentioned the importance of those insects. How did the cicada outbreak last year affect our turkey populations?
Well, in a nutshell, you think in 2 years ago, we harvested 17,000 birds in Ohio during the spring. Last year, we harvested a little bit over 21,000 birds in the state. And so you can see, really the only difference was the cicada hatch from last year. And that just occurred pretty much in the eastern half of the state. But our largest harvest came from our previous cicada hatch, and now we've had this a bump. So it was just like giant morsels of food laying there everywhere for poults to feed on. Not only turkey poults, but potentially if there's grouse there, but a lot of songbirds and other animals were feeding on those cicadas. So something that I used to always think was a really bad thing from a forester standpoint, from a wildlife standpoint, can be very beneficial.
Well, I'm getting the cue that we need to take a little break. So this is Dave Apsley with Tree Talk, and my guest is Lee Crocker. We'll be right back. So we're back. I'm Dave Apsley with OSU Extension, and Lee Crocker, my guest, is with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And when we went to break, we were talking a little bit about turkeys and the cicadas. So trying to think what else we need to cover. Any wildlife topics that are hot that you want to discuss? Or
Well, a lot of, when we're talking about game animals specifically, there's a lot of people want to do food plots and those types of things for hunters. That's a big thing. So if you're going to do that, you need to think about what's your purpose for planting that. Is it to provide a food during the winter? Is it to provide, all year food? Is it some people are planting plots that they're going to potentially hunt over. So you need to think about that. You're not going to really probably increase the overall population of deer in the state by planting food plots, but you might attract specific animals to your property at the time that you want them there.
Yeah, one really good piece of advice that I heard a biologist talk a little while ago, it's important to just look at your property and see where you lay in, where you fit in the big grand scheme of things. And when we think about wildlife, we need to talk about habitat. So what do wildlife need? They need some kind of food, they need cover, they need water, and then they need space. They need space to have their territories and set them up. So I think it's important to, if you get an opportunity to get a person like Lee Crocker from National Wild Turkey Federation or a private lands biologist from Division of Wildlife onto your property and have those discussions about what you're trying to accomplish, and then also what can you do on your property. I think that's a valuable thing to do.
Yeah, it's one of the services we offer with the National Wild Turkey Federation. I work with landowners. I'll make a landowner visit, try to come up with some type of a wildlife habitat plan. So once we figure out what you want to do, then we come up with a plan of how you can get there. And sometimes there's government programs that can help you fund some of that. Sometimes there's not, but I'll help you work through all that situation. But Dave made a great point that you need to look not only at your property, but the properties around it and see what the overall habitat and component there is. I have a lot of landowners that call me and they may own 30 acres like you, and they say, I want turkey and I want them to stay on my property all year long. Well, that's just not feasible with the turkey's movement and turkey's food needs and habitat needs. But we can improve that property so they will be there more often and those types of things. So something to think about.
Same thing with deer. I've heard like a buck has a home range of about a square mile. So unless we're fortunate enough to own 640 acres, the odds are we're not going to be able to manage everything for that buck.
Typically that home range isn't a perfect square.
No.
And what we found out in the last few years with GPS tracking collars and those things, when the rut comes, the deer's home range expands, and that may be a long linear home range, so it might be 3 or 4 miles, it might be farther. A really interesting story about turkey. We had some tracking units on some turkey up in Ashtabula County, up in the northeastern part of the state, and we had a hen that was we were following, and on her third re-nest, her nest failed. She moved 5 miles away
Wow.
to try her fourth nest. Now the fourth nest failed, but it also tells you how far away she was willing to go to try to get a successful nest.
So one of the things I want to do before we run out of time today is talk about some educational opportunities that are coming down the pike. As we've mentioned on other programs, one of the things that we do in partnership with the Wild Turkey Federation, Division of Forestry, and Division of Wildlife is our Day in the Woods program. And we've got a variety of classes that we offer, mostly at the Vinton Furnace State Forest, but there are a couple opportunities coming up that I want to mention. The first one is like the third one down on the list, the summer tree identification on July 28th. So that's 2 weeks from this coming Friday. We're going to spend the day learning how to identify trees. And that's important for wildlife if you think about things like oak and hickory and the food sources they provide. And then the other piece is on August 11th at the Vinton Furnace State Forest. We're going to have a program focusing on managing private lands or your property for wildlife, focusing on game. So that ought to be an interesting opportunity to interact with some wildlife biologists at the Vinton Furnace.
Yeah, the Day in the Woods programs we've had those the past several years, and they have been great. It gives us as professionals a chance to interact with other people and show you specific examples of how to manage for game. Or we just recently had one on songbirds, the one on tree identification. If you can't identify your trees, it's going to be very difficult for you to manage your habitat for wildlife species or for forest species or even for aesthetics. If you just like a tree that is really pretty in the fall, you need to know what species are out there so you can do that.
And that's important. I know my first interest in trees and learning to identify them was back in the day when I was probably a young teenager learning to squirrel hunt. And, learning where your oaks are and the different oaks and when the acorns are mature and the hickory nuts are mature. And learn pretty early on that if you want to go out there early, find that buckeye tree because the squirrels are going to be out there. So understanding what trees you have on your property and what might be missing and how you can add to that is, I think, real important. And with the all-day course, we're going to do it at Hocking College, and we'll have probably at least 4, if not 6 different instructors there. We'll be hands-on, we'll be in the field. We'll teach you some basics, but then we'll get you out there and point out those trees and talk about some of the value they have for wildlife as well.
Yeah, it's really a great, the tree ID ones are great to pick up. Maybe you think you know most of your trees, but you'll pick up some tips, some ways to identify trees that you didn't know about, and some unusual species you'll pick up. So it's, even if you think you're pretty good at tree identification, I always learn tips even though I've been doing this for a long time. So it's a good thing, and it's a good day.
And then the program that we've got later in August, the second week in August, is going to focus on those species, those game wildlife species, and that's on August 11th. And we're going to have, Mark Wiley is the gentleman that's kind of coordinating that effort, but we're going to have one of the state deer biologists there to talk about our deer populations and how we can manage for deer. And we're going to focus on mainly probably turkey, a little bit on grouse, some on deer. We'll get into those wildlife species that depend on our forests. So.
Yeah, it'll be a great day, and you think there at the Vinton they'll be able to show you specific examples of practices that can be done on your property that'll benefit turkey, deer, grouse, woodcock, rabbits, squirrels, and then if you want to talk other species too. But
sure.
There's a lot of things that you'll be able to see. You'll get hands-on experience of what you can do there to help your wildlife on your property.
What we're excited about with those Day in the Woods programs is we'll probably have 4 or 5 wildlife biologists out there that day. We'll have at least a couple, if not 3 or 4 foresters to spend the day with you. And we'll do some of the presentations in the classroom, but we'll get out on a wagon and we'll get out into the woods and we'll just experience, we may see a little bit of wildlife, but it's more about the habitat and how we manage it.
Yeah, you'll be able to see what's needed, how you can get to that point on your property, and if you want to try to do that, and how to go about that. And it's great because you'll be able to interact with these biologists and these foresters and ask them specific questions too about your property. when you're out there in the field and look at examples. So it's always been a good day to do that.
The other thing, if you're not familiar with Event and Furnace, is we have a series of over a dozen demonstration plots. We've got different type of harvests. We've got one that's going on its third growing season, so you can look at a small clear cut and see how it changes over time. We can take you to that 3-year-old clear cut. We can take you to one that's going on 20 years old now, and then if you'd like, you can see how it changes over time and even get into those 40, 50, 60-year-old clear cuts as well. So I kind of brought up clear cutting because I know how a lot of people feel about clear cutting. But what are your thoughts on clear cutting for a private landowner, and how could they use that as a tool, or would they even want to use it as a tool?
Well, for turkey, it creates potential nesting sites, brood habitat for deer, this abundance of browse, herbaceous vegetation. If you're thinking about woodcock or grouse, it may be the only way to create some of their habitat. And out there at the Venton, we've got that young clear cut. We've got some older ones. Sad to say that Dave and I probably both we're around on both of those, and we weren't there on the ones that are about 50 years old, but the others we were there, and we've been involved with those. So those are a good way to improve habitat.
And I think one of the things that the public perception of clear cuts, you automatically hear that term and you're thinking 1,000-acre area that's all devastating. And on private lands, we're probably talking something maybe an acre or two in size, up to maybe 8 or 10 acres in size. So depending on the size of your property, that may or may not fit into your management goals. But having some of that younger forest habitat is really important for a lot of species out there. So it's a tool that you can use. It may not be the one that fits for your property.
I have a lot of real intensive deer management people that are going in, and even if it's not commercial to do a harvest, they're going in and cutting down half-acre size blocks. They'll do what a lot of people call hinge cutting, but they'll just go in. I was on a property this week looking at, he had done 8 of these on his property to create that browse and that security cover for deer and turkey. So this is it's one of our best tools to create the habitat.
So really, there's a variety of techniques. Lee and I are both trained as foresters. We picked up some biology and wildlife over the years. Lee's picked up a little more than I have on the wildlife side, but I think it's important to realize that forest management and wildlife management go hand in hand, and we can manage those young forests. There are things we can do in an older forest. For instance, give those tree species that provide wildlife food some more space to grow so they can get bigger crowns and produce more food for wildlife. So a lot of things we can do in the woods as private woodland owners. And even as a forester myself, I love to have the opportunity to bring in someone like Lee or another biologist to learn, because we all have our experiences to draw from. So we're getting close to wrapping it up. Is there anything else you want to add in that's coming up down the pike? Or
no, it's just been a pleasure to be here. National Wild Turkey Federation is a big supporter of landowners and conservation of wild turkey, and also creating hunting heritage. And pleasure to be here today, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
We love to have you here, and it's nice to have a fellow Boilermaker. I got to be careful as an OSU employee, but to have another Boilermaker on board to talk a little bit about forest management and wildlife. So this has been Tree Talk with Dave Apsley, and our guest today has been Lee Crocker with the National Wild Turkey Federation. Hope to see you next time.